And we are back. You're welcome to join the program, WMFO, 91.5 AM, Tufts University, Medford, Somerville. 855-915-9636 is the number. 855-915-9636. As I continue to try to finagle this YouTube business, I'm not quite adept at getting it done, but there it is. So I talked about the Rachel Maddow fraud situation, but that's something else. I want to get into now the main crux of what I wanted to bring to the table today, and what I promoted the program as getting into, and that is the overturning of the Trump travel ban. Apparently, U.S. District Judge Derek Watson from Hawaii, who is now being joined by I believe one, if not two, other federal judges in jurisdictions, they have put a temporary stay on President Trump's executive order that would have placed a temporary travel ban on immigrants and a reduction of travel permits from a list of 6 predominantly Muslim nations. Now, let's put aside the national security question about this for a minute. And that is that these nations on this list indisputably and documentedly and harbor enemies of America. They harbor enemy combatants. They harbor terrorists. They harbor people who have declared war against the United States, and indeed who are carrying out acts of war against the United States, American citizens, American property, all over the world and in this country, and have been doing so for many decades. That's indisputable. That was acknowledged by President Obama. That's been acknowledged by our national security apparatus. That's not up to question. Now, in some cases, these nations are not necessarily formally harboring the terrorists. They're failed states. They've lost control of their own sovereignty, of their own system. And thus terrorists are there, like in Afghanistan, for example. But either way, they are responsible for what happens from their territory. That was something that was established by the Bush administration. It's known as the Bush Doctrine, which was developed after the attack of September 11th, 2001. And thus, they were put on a list of nations to be concerned about, at least, by President Obama. Well, President Trump has taken it the next step, and he has sought a temporary ban on people from those countries entering into the United States until we can figure out whether or not those who are coming have an affiliation with the organizations that are at war with the United States. And when I say at war, I don't think anyone would argue with me that that means war. They're killing Americans. And they're trying to kill Americans inside this country. I don't think that's a matter of controversy. I think that's understood. But putting aside the fact that this is the motivation of the president to put these nations on this list, and putting aside whether or not it's a good idea from a national security standpoint, it may be, it may not be, okay? It gets to a more fundamental question. It gets to a constitutional question. And that constitutional question is whether or not it is appropriate, whether it is lawful for our government, as in this case the executive branch, to regulate the immigration of peoples in such a manner. Now, the fundamental question, Judge Watson, who made the ruling in Hawaii, was agreed with a group of left-wing lawyers who argued that it was unconstitutional for the United States to ban Muslims from entering the country, as such a ban, they argued, constituted religious discrimination. Specifically, the ban on Muslim immigrants, they argued, discriminated against the mother-in-law of a Hawaii Muslim cleric. And this is putting aside the fact that the mother-in-law in question could have been given a waiver if the congressman from Hawaii requested such a waiver from the State Department, which he probably would have received. Instead, they decided to open the floodgates to everybody because this one person wanted to enter the United States, who clearly was someone who was innocent, right? It reminds me of the Frank Amendment, which is another story for another day. Yet it still calls to a more fundamental question, and that is, does the United States, or for that matter, does any sovereign nation, today or in history, have a basic right to decide who enters the national home? International law and custom, as well as common law of nations, going all the way back to ancient times, indicate that such a right exists. And common sense tells us that this exists. Nations do have the right to decide who comes into the national home for the same reason that you, my listener, has the right to decide who enters your home, right? Whether you own the place or whether you rent the place, however it happens, whether it's your dorm room, you have a legal right, a lawful right, to decide who enters your place. And once they're there, you have a right to decide how long they stay there. You can regulate your home. That your home is your space. If you want them to leave, they have to leave. You're absolutely on legal grounds in that assertion. Those are natural laws that are established and are supported by our system of justice. I mean, for example, if a person enters your home without permission, there's a law against that. It's called breaking and entering, right? If a person stays in your home without your permission, there's a law against that. It's called trespassing. I mean, this is, it's not up to question. I mean, we understand this. We understand it. It reflects not just our legal system, but it reflects our entire way of life, and not just in this country, but in any country. Even in communist countries, people had a say over who entered their space. It's natural to the human being to have a certain amount of sovereignty, if you will, over your immediate environment. Even if you're walking out on the street, if someone comes too close to you and they make you uncomfortable, you can charge them with assault. I mean, this is something that even transcends human society. I mean, it exists in nature. This exists in the animal kingdom. I mean, have you ever tried to violate the space of a dog, for example? You'll get your hand bit, right? I mean, a bird doesn't let another bird violate its nest. A beaver doesn't let another animal violate its dam. A bee doesn't let a foreign bee enter its hive. I mean, these things are observable in nature. They are what define the being, the identity, the entity, the living being. Every living being has a space. That is just a fact of nature. There's no way around that. And so we establish governments to reflect nature. And in this case, we establish governments to make sure that we regulate who enters the national home, as opposed to the private home, or as opposed to our local community even. The national government gets to decide who enters the national home for whatever reason they choose. They reflect our values. If we don't want to have a person or a group enter our national home, then that is reflected in our government policy. We don't have to explain why. We don't need to justify it. In the same way that you don't have to justify why you don't want to have some person enter your private home. This is a natural right of sovereign nations. And thus, you have this particular judge saying no to our government when our government is simply exercising the same right that every government has exercised since the founding of the Republic, and that indeed every government in the world exercises, right? I mean, do you think you can enter into Cuba if you want to? Do you think you can enter into Zimbabwe anytime you want?